This is the Climate Academy Systems Understanding course, and this is chapter 11 on the psychology of climate change. In fact, we have two chapters here on the psychology of climate change, and everything which I'm going to say can be found inside the student book. This is available for free in the Climate Academy website, more specifically inside the Moodle. And after you've been through this episode, you can do the quiz, which you can find inside the Moodle. And that's another piece inside the jigsaw of your systems understanding of this crisis. So we're now shifting very fully into the human aspects of the crisis. The systems understanding course starts with all the earth science of what's going on, and now we're moving into the details of the human science of it all. And a major aspect of this is inside here, this rather complex part of the universe, which is called the human brain. And how we think and respond to climate change is wired up here. So this deserves 2 chapters worth of exploration. Why is climate change so difficult to see? The most common answer to this question is to make an analogy by talking about the difference between trees and forests. So if you look at a tree in the forest, that is an individual tree, and you need to take a rather special position to see all the trees inside a forest. You need a high vantage point. And the analogy is that trees are individual weather events. So these are sensory. We do have a sense of climate change sometimes when there's an extreme weather event. But those are not climate change in themselves. You have to be able to look at the whole forest to see the patterns and to see if that one tree or that one weather event is part of a wider pattern of things which is going on. So climate change really can't be seen by the senses. It has to be seen from this higher vantage point, which is science, and science in graphs. Now, in the earlier chapters, we saw the key graphs to climate change relate to CO2 levels. So here's the classic one, the Keeling curve. And this Keeling curve graph shows us the concentrations in parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. But to many people, it doesn't have much impact. What does that even mean? Why is that graph even relevant? So we need to convert those basic data points into something a little bit more realistic. And the scientist Ed Hawkins has very helpfully done this for us in 2 ways. The first is this spiral graph. This spiraling graph of temperatures shows what happens when those CO2 levels play out in terms of temperature, because we know that greenhouse gases cause temperature rises. So now you can see as the rings on that graph shift from a blue colour in pre-industrial or early industrial age through to the red colours of modern times. And now we get to feel the reality of climate change in a more in a clearer way. So thank you, Ed Hawkins, for that graph. But he's actually more famous for this graph. These are the warming stripes. And these put into coloured bands the reality of climate change. So now we have the temperature spread out across the page from the cool blue stripes on the left through to the warming stripes, the warmer stripes on the right. And you can see the acceleration in temperature in the last few years. Now, in terms of the psychology of climate change, these graphs are very helpful because they help us visualize what is going on. But they still don't tell the full story. In earlier chapters, I mentioned that many people don't understand why a 2-degree temperature rise is significant. So you need like a story about that, and the most common one which I use is the one with the human fever. Having a temperature, a bodily temperature of 2 degrees is a fever, and that means you can't really function very well in the world. Having a raised bodily temperature internal of 4 degrees is hyperpyrexia, and that, according to doctors, is a medical emergency. So even when we get the visualizations of climate changing graphs, we still need a little bit of conversion into how that practically affects planet Earth, human civilization on planet Earth. And if we go down that route, we can actually visualize climate change quite clearly in terms of impact by looking at sea level rises. Climate Central have set up a really fantastic website where you can play around with different sea levels to show what happens if, for example, the West Antarctic ice sheet melts. So here are some maps we can play around with, and you can see here, let's start where I am at home here. This is northwestern Europe. And if we shift the map from 0, as it is, to plus 5 meters, you can see that this has a catastrophic effect on the Netherlands, on cities like The Hague, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, cities with millions of people in them, with histories and stories and culture and so on. And if we go across to America, we can do the same. We can look at Florida and see what a 5-meter rise in sea level does there, and the same for New Orleans. And you can do the same thing for New York. Raising the sea level by 5 meters, which would be the effect of the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet, raising the sea level by 5 meters for these ultra-high developed nations is going to have a massive impact. They are not immune from sea level rises, but things are much worse if we turn to the east and we look at the country of Bangladesh. Look at what happens when you just shift the sea level by 1 meter. And if we take it all the way up to 5, this is an absolute catastrophe. And there are other cities in Asia which suffer at 5-degree meter rises as well. Cities like Singapore and cities like Shanghai. So here, if we can visualize the effect at one level of climate change, which is sea level rise, then we start to understand why climate change is so significant for human civilization. How did we get into this heap of trouble? Well, there's a little pun going on here, because heap in Greek is soros, and that word soros gives us the Sorites paradox. And how we got into this heap of trouble in climate change is actually due to something psychological. One of the reasons for our inaction is rooted in this paradox that the ancient Greeks understood. So what is the Sorites paradox, and how did it get us into this mess? Well, if you think about a grain of sand, that is self-evidently a grain of sand. And 2 grains of sand are just 2 grains of sand. If we had 10,000 grains of sand on the desk here, then this was no longer, you can't point at grains of sand anymore. This is evidently a heap. And the question asked by the ancient Greek philosophers was, when do we move from being grains of sand to heap of sand? At what point does it become a heap? And the answer to that is rather oddly, weirdly elusive. It's a bit vague. In fact, in philosophy, they call it the problem of vagueness. You can't really put your finger on the moment at which, or you can't define the moment at which grains of sand become a heap of sand. Now, this very abstract problem has got very practical ways in which it plays out in terms of human behavior. Faced with a homework, a student will typically think, well, I've got 7 days to do the homework. I might start tomorrow, or I might start in 3 days. So 1 day doesn't make a difference to the deadline. But there is a point at which it becomes impossible to do the homework because it's just too late to start. So behind every procrastinator's procrastination is the Sorites paradox is in play. So this problem of vagueness is actually a problem that infects our response to the climate crisis, because when you look at the Critics Index from chapter 7, and there it shows you very clearly what each country has to do every year to fix the problem. A country might say, well, we'll just wait a couple more years, the number might go up a bit, but then we'll just deal with that later. And this is how we got into a heap of trouble. And even when very sensory things happen now, where climate change impacts through an extreme weather event, or as in the case of the coral reefs in dying and going beyond a tipping point, even at that point, we say to ourselves, well, we've still got a bit of time. There's still a margin of ambiguity left for us to fix this crisis later. And so this problem of procrastination and this problem of stalling on action is something which is rooted in our psychology, and that psychological weakness is rooted in something very abstract, the Sorites paradox. What is psychic numbing? Psychic numbing is when a situation or a problem or a tragedy is so big it just fuses our brains out and we just can't compute it, we can't feel it, we become numb to it. A famous quote on this comes from Stalin, who reportedly said that 1 death is a tragedy and 1,000,000 deaths are a statistic. We're not sure he really said that, but if he did, he would got it seems, from a German pacifist and satirist, Kurt Tucholsky, from 1932, who said something quite similar about war. The point is that when the tragedy or the suffering reaches a level which is unimaginable, at a scale that we just can't wrap our heads around, we become psychologically numb to it. And this is a problem for climate change, because the end game in climate change is so catastrophic. It's hard psychologically for us to grasp it and to absorb it or assimilate information or respond to it. The example I give in the textbook is the one from the Himalayas, because the Hindu Kush and the Himalayan glacial ice supports millions of people. In fact, 2.56 billion. That number of people depend on that ice for fresh water. And if those glaciers go and melt, and at 3 degrees it is critically endangered, then that would trigger an unimaginable amount of suffering for an unimaginable number of people. And when that scientific report about the melting of the Himalayan glaciers came out, it did actually reach, on the BBC website, it reached the front line, the front homepage, but it didn't last there more than about half an hour. It had sunk through underneath various sports headlines eventually and shrank into the environment section and so on. Now, a report of that significance should have held our attention for much longer than it did, but it didn't. And one way we can understand that lack of interest is through this concept of psychic numbing. Just before we move on to the next question, let me share with you the difference between 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000. We struggle, when numbers get very big, we struggle to crunch them and understand their significance. So 1,000,000 minutes ago was 2 years ago. a billion minutes ago was 114 BCE, when the Roman world was not yet a dictatorship. It was still a republic with 2 elected senators on a yearly rotation, one of whom was called Cato at the time. The Roman Empire had not yet got to the shores of England, and Jesus was more than 100 years away from being born. So the difference between a million minutes and a billion minutes is dramatic. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why many people, including myself, have got a big problem with the existence of billionaires. Because if there are many millionaires, then that is one thing. But having lots of billionaires, the sheer size of that wealth and its capacity to own the infrastructure of our economies and our democracies and so on is significantly, it's a different order of things. But because the words are so close, we don't necessarily, we don't respond in the same way. So a million minutes, a billion minutes, millionaires, billionaires, the magnitude of difference between the two things is hard for us to grasp if we just see the numbers on paper. It's important to cash these concepts out in terms of reality. What are heuristics? Well, it's the rule of thumb. Heuristics is an educated guess about what is the case. And this is an important talent that humans have in our psychological imagination. We can make good guesses about things, and this helps us. We don't always have to have spreadsheets to make decisions. But in terms of climate and the psychology of climate change, our heuristics can be a little bit wonky. So research was done on this, and in various papers, our ability to properly diagnose or read a situation in terms of environmental impacts is a little bit dodgy, is a bit weak. For example, many people, when presented with a red meat dish on its own, or a red meat dish with a bio or a bio-friendly side salad, they guessed that the red meat with the side salad had a smaller environmental impact than just the red meat. Likewise, people in a room that was a little bit heated were more likely to accept climate change statistics and data than in a cool air-conditioned one. And with electric cars, many people think that electric cars are far better than petrol cars or diesel cars, but actually, when you think it through, the situation is much more complex. So, as a rule of thumb, although it can help us in everyday life, in terms of climate change and in terms of our environmental imagination, sometimes it can go wrong. So that's why it's important to have a systems view of things. We should always, this is the systems understanding course, the value of the systems understanding course is it holds things at a systems level so you can see things in their proper perspective. So systems thinking is not just useful for seeing Earth systems and economic systems and stuff like that. It's also important and useful for being able to put things in their proper shape and in their proper perspective. What are System 1 and System 2 brain networks? Well, Daniel Kahneman, in his Nobel Prize winning, this triggered his Nobel Prize, in his work Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, he did important work defining the difference between these two brain systems. So System 1. System 1 is your instinctive, fast, reflex responses to things. They're generally emotional responses, like those kind of things. System 2 is your methodical, critical, slower thinking networks in the brain. And to show the difference between these two things in the textbook, I use the example of chocolate cockroaches, because anybody would find it difficult to eat a chocolate cockroach, because the system 1 networks in your brain would be shouting at you, that's a cockroach, you don't eat that, that's disgusting. So your sensory kind of reflex emotional response to a cockroach is one of repulsion. It's like an icky bug to be avoided. But if it's made out of chocolate, and if you know it's made out of chocolate, and if you're told and you see it being made, you could eat it. But there your system 2, which is rational, which is critical, which is analytical, which is methodical and flexible, this can override the network 1 and say, no, it's okay. You can eat the cockroach. It's just a chocolate cockroach, not a real It's not a real cockroach. So in our system as humans, in our brain systems, we have like a fundamental conflict between this network which is fast and the network which is slow. And in terms of climate change, essentially what is required from humanity is for us to take our system 2 networks and override our system 1 networks. And this plays out in different ways. Just on the most general level, of course, we are creatures of consumption and happiness, and we are natural consumers in a way. But in order to put limits on that, or to think critically about our consumption, this requires level 2, system 2 thinking, more analytical and reflective consumption. Or in terms of politics, it's quite easy to sell visceral politics like tribal politics, or politics which appeals to the emotions, to fear, and so on. And it's harder to get votes if you appeal to system 2, to compromise, to critical and responses or nuanced responses. So in both the economic level and at the political level, we have to put effort into making sure that our system 2, our slow thinking networks, have a capacity to not allow the system 1, fast and impulsive networks, from overriding everything. It's a challenge, and that's why climate education is so important, because it strengthens this system 2 level of our brain network. What is the science of science communication? At the simplest level, it's a research paper by the researcher Daniel Kahan. So we're going from Kahneman to Kahan, 2 Daniels, but they're both interested in psychology, and in the case of Kahan, very sharply interested in the psychology of our responses to climate change. And the best way to start this is actually to do a little bit of an IQ test. So here's a science IQ test. Here are some typical questions that were asked by Kahan and his team of Americans. So you can try and answer these questions yourself. First question: if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, things, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? The answer is 5 minutes. And the answers, the percentage that I'm going to show, will be the percentage for how many Americans got that question right. Okay, here's another question. If the chance of getting a disease is 20 out of 100, then this will be the same as having what percentage chance of getting that disease? And the answer is 20%. And 75% of Americans got that question right. Question number 3. How long does it take the sun to go around, the Earth to go around the sun? Does it take a day, a month, or a year? And 60% of Americans get this question right. A more challenging question is the one about a lily. So if a lily in a lake doubles in size every day, and if it takes 48 days for the patch of lilies to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half the lake? And the answer is 47 days, because if it doubles in size every day, after day 47, if it's half, then it will be full on day 48. But only 19% of Americans get that question right. Finally, the bat ball question. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? And the answer is 5 cents. And then the bat is $1.05. So the difference is $1. Now that one is a little bit tricky. I'm sure many of you didn't get that, because that only 13% of Americans get that question right. Now you can ask questions like this of, we're going to call it scientific literacy, so a kind of a basic numeracy. You can ask questions about which gas is most common in the atmosphere, to which the answer is nitrogen. Those kind of questions establish somebody's scientific literacy. So not emotional intelligence or not general intelligence, but scientific intelligence. And Kahan interviewed thousands of Americans, asking them questions like this, and what he predicted was that people with a higher scientific intelligence would perceive climate change to have a higher risk. And you can put this into a line, and it's called the PIT line, or the PIT curve. And the line is sloped so that the more intelligent you are, the more you perceive climate change to be a risk, and the less scientific intelligence you have, the less you might understand the risks of what are involved. But here's the surprise. The prediction doesn't match the reality. The line is basically flat. In fact, it even slopes down a little bit, where a higher intelligence even reduces your perceived risk of climate change. And this is a weird result, given that everything we have said up to now in all the other chapters, it should be pretty clear that this is a climate change, and pushing our Earth systems towards tipping points is profoundly risky. And surely it doesn't take that much scientific intelligence to understand that. And yet, the results of Kahan's work show that the line is flat. So this is a big mystery. And to understand it, we need to go into a deep dive. So let's put this PIT line back in place. And what we need to do is we need to split out from this data two different types of Americans. We need to split out the liberal Democrats from the conservative Republicans. And when you add that filter into the responses about climate change, then you can start to understand why the line is flat. Because, as you can see now, the more intelligent you are, the more scientifically literate you are as a conservative Republican, the less likely it is, in fact it's very unlikely, that you would admit climate change to be a problem. And therefore you can see that a filter is in place on scientific knowledge. So why is this filter in place? What's going on? What's the problem? What's the problem with conservative Republicans? And Kahan digs deeper into this, and he looks at all the issues in politics where a response to a problem would require government intervention. And in all the issues where government intervention is required, you find that conservative Republicans generally don't see those things as risky or as a problem. whereas the line is flat for them where the issue is actually government, let's say government neutral. So here we see, if we pick up Kahneman's language from before of system 2 thinking, here we can see that system 2 power is being deployed by conservative Republicans to filter out or to block out information because of a tribal commitment. A tribal commitment to non-government intervention. So in terms of the deep psychological forces that are in play, these background, let's call them grammatical influences on thinking, make it possible for smart, educated, scientifically literate people to diminish or suppress, or even in some cases deny, the risk of climate change. So it's a really illuminating set of graphs to show how our intelligence is not some sort of neutrally upright set of knowledge. It's actually profoundly influenced by political commitments. And a sharp example of this actually just hit my YouTube channel. Some algorithm must have spat it out at me in a weird way a few days ago. So here is a clip of an interview between Jordan Peterson and a guy called Richard Litson.
Goebbels famously said, if you tell a big enough lie and repeat it often enough, it'll become the truth. There's been a lot of that in this, but there are aspects of establishing the narrative, i.e. what makes something the truth, that I hadn't appreciated. So the narrative was the climate is determined by a greenhouse effect, and adding CO2 to it increases it, causes warming, and moreover, the natural greenhouse substances besides CO2, water vapor, clouds, upper-level clouds, will amplify whatever man does. Now, that immediately goes against Le Chatelier's principle, which says if you perturb a system and it is capable internally of counteracting it, it will.
So, Linson, it's mind-boggling how this is possible. This short clip, but it goes on for about 50 minutes, the interview, but it's a remarkable example of how the mind can filter and morph information because of political allegiances. If you scratch on the surface of Linson's background, it's been reported that he has connections with the Cato Institute, which is funded by the fossil fuel industry, and he is very skeptical also, it seems, on secondhand tobacco effects. Again, this is absolutely typical of a constellation of thinking in which anything which requires government intervention, for example in tobacco, smoking, or in climate change, this is just filtered out. But to have this happen to somebody who is a meteorologist it's a bit like Stranger Things. This is like the upside down world where okay, so this example, it's kind of an unnerving example of just how able and sophisticated humans are with their brain to line up data in a way which fits with a pre-existing commitment, rather than allowing the data to actually interrogate you or to be accepted at face value. And here the work of Konrad Lorenz is interesting. So he was a zoologist, famous zoologist. And if you Google images of him, you see him often with pictures of geese following him, because he understood the notion of printing in biology. So when a duck is first born and the first thing it sees, it prints into its imagination that this must be mother. Now, no matter what it is. So this printing, Lorenz understood in the animal world, is in play. And that zoological insight is useful for us in thinking in terms of politics. Because if you think about America and the founding of the United States of America, the basic DNA of the psychology of the colonies at the beginning, which then became the United States, was a reaction against government. And so that background DNA of thought or DNA of psychology is seriously in play, so that when an issue like climate change happens, it is filtered out. It is blocked by these basic tribalistic or, well, you could even say zoological realities in terms of printing. Now, in Kahan's work, this makes it sound like the science of science communication is going to be truly difficult. Well, it is. I mean, let's accept the difficulties that are in play here. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible, because those same commitments to political coordinates can actually work in your favor. So, for example, in climate change, rather than talk about climate change in terms of justice and equality, which are generally the language of, let's call it, the left, if you can talk about climate change in terms of policies which would fit within the tribal psychological space of conservative Republicans, then it could work, or it has a higher chance of working. You could talk in terms of property, you could talk in terms of security, you could talk in terms of immigration. The key issues for that group of people, climate change will have an effect on it. If we go back to the sea level rises that we mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, monumental sea level rises will lead to monumental migration. And this is not something which conservative Republicans are very enthusiastic about. Likewise, when property goes underwater, like in the state of Florida or New Orleans or Mississippi, there you have a question of wealth and property and security. So in terms of those things, you have a soft psychological zone through which you could talk about climate change and probably have a much higher impact. So understanding the science of science communication is critical, so that first of all, we're not just throwing numbers at people, we have to put stories on it. And secondly, that when we do attach a story to those numbers, the story fits strategically with what people are most naturally interested in. This is not manipulation, this is just common sense. It's just a way of being a bit more smart about your climate communications. And to finish this deep dive, let me just show you this famous image of Charlie Chaplin's mask.
This is the hollow head. Actually, at the moment, it's a perfectly normal head of Charlie Chaplin, but wait, as it comes round, you'll see, or will you, that it's hollow. The back of it, coming round now, is actually a hollow mask. It appears to rotate in the opposite direction, and amazingly, the nose sticks out, although it's actually sticking in. Coming round now is the normal, correct as it were, face, and wait again as it comes round, and you'll see this extraordinary thing like Jekyll and Hyde. Both the noses stick out because it's so unlikely that a nose sticks in that a face is hollow. So you see it as convex, although it's in fact concave, as now, and then it'll become the normal face again, there. And note that as soon as the features appear in the hollow inside, it will look convex, as though it's a normal face almost, though it isn't. As soon as the features appear, there. Your brain refuses to see it as hollow simply because it is so unlikely. And this demonstrates the immense power of top-down knowledge, which can actually counter signals bottom up from the senses and force an extraordinary illusion in which the sensory information of the present is cancelled by immense knowledge derived from the past, because you've seen so many faces, all with their noses sticking out. So it's just impossible to see that as correctly hollow.
So in conclusion, Lorenz's geese, this face mask of Charlie Chaplin, and Daniel Kahan's work on the science of science communication shows that we have to be savvy and aware of various blocks that are in place, or dynamics in psychology, which could prevent us from communicating effectively about the risks and the dangers involved ahead. What is status quo bias? It's irresistible. Of course, there's a joke here about the band Status Quo and their simple 4-chord music, and I certainly don't have a bias towards that music, but the actual thing is a simple psychological a simple description of a psychological reality, which is that humans prefer the status quo. We prefer what is familiar, what is safe, what is known, and we tend to be risk averse. So, a couple of easy examples. If you have an insurance policy with a company for 5 years, and that company's policy is more expensive than another one, there's a weird inertia in moving from the company you know to a new one. The risks of the uncertainty of moving to something else create a kind of resistance to change. In a restaurant, second example, in a restaurant, many people choose the same food that they've had because they had a nice steak or a nice vegetarian dish, and they're just going to do that again because it was great. And the risk of trying something else is probably not worth it. So the center of gravity is always to the status quo, to things which are familiar. So this status quo bias in terms of climate change plays out in different ways. It essentially is like an inertia for the present. So policies which might be pointing towards more radical action on climate will look like unfamiliar, and people will naturally psychologically retreat to a dysfunctional situation, even if climate policies right now are not doing enough. But in a weird, odd way, well, it's just what we're familiar with. And something new, something fresh, something adventurous carries with it unknown risks. And in another way, and we'll explore this in the next chapter on the psychology of climate change with Friedrich Nietzsche, there's also a psychological tendency to assume that the present will always be reflected in the future. And we can't really imagine that this is going to be radically different. The current Earth system stability could radically change. So the status quo bias is just a kind of unhelpful center of gravity in our simple psychological dispositions of humans to not want to shift into a new gear, just because it might seem a little bit risky. So that's the end of chapter 11, and everything can be found in here. Maybe now is a good time to go and do a simple 10-question quiz. The quiz questions come from a bank of questions. They're just randomly selected. And this is your next brick in the wall in terms of the systems understanding certificate. And unusually, the next chapter is also on climate change, on the psychology of climate change. But what I'm going to do in the next chapter is I'm going to take some of my best friends and get them to talk about this. my best friends being philosophers. I'm a philosophy teacher. So we're going to pick 6 philosophers who have got psychological insights, people like Nietzsche, Freud, Hannah Arendt, Thomas Paine and so on, Karl Marx, and Popper. And I'm going to mobilize these to go deeper into the psychology of climate change. So although they're called philosophers, often philosophy involves quite a lot of deep excavations of psychological realities. So that is coming up in the next chapter.